So, as consultants, the biggest pain is when our clients can't really articulate where they are, where they need to go, and what they need from us when we do a project with them. Our usual approach is to just brute force that by just doing endless discovery conversations. But the reality of it is that there's a better way of handling that ambiguity, and today I want to show you how I use collaborative workshops as a tool to navigate that. A few weeks ago, I created this demo workshop for the team at Stratos Consulting to show them how I use collaborative workshops like the one that you see here to solve that exact problem that I was mentioning. So how to help consultancies that work in the data space or in the AI space actually understand what clients need and sell bigger and better projects through doing activities that are guided just like the one that you see here. So check out the highlights from our conversation and let me know what you think in the comments. I'll be happy to share the frameworks and share more.
The way we would always start these conversations, whether it's either ideating or defining priorities or whatever, is to start very broad. So I would obviously explain the particulars of this activity and say, like, we're doing this series of activities to accomplish X outcome. This is what we're going to be doing over the course of the day. And I would explain the structure of the session. So in this case, what I want you guys to do, right, is from the perspective of the client that you're play acting as in terms of all these categories. So the entirety of the data lifecycle, like we talked about. So anything from how data is sourced to how it's ingested, where it's stored, how it gets transformed into usable forms, how it gets visualized and reported into usable analytics, and then how it gets automated. Obviously, there are pieces across all of those things that are not included. So like governance being a big one, just general like evolution and the sort of, what is it, like the general growth into like AI tools as well. There's a lot of details that are not involved in there, but this is just to generally give it shape. And so what we would discuss prior to doing an activity like this, like meaning you guys and I, would be what specific topics do we want to lean more out of this, like the entirety of data needs. Some organizations maybe don't want to talk about, let's say, sourcing data at all. They might want to talk about automating or visualizing or governing it or whatever. And we would actually structure this activity based on that. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes perfect sense.
So what we're going to do to start is I'm going to set a timer here for a couple minutes. Like I said, let's pretend we are in the session. I've already introduced everything. We've all done sort of we've gone around the room, introduce what everybody's roles are. And what I'd like you guys to do is to click on, you'll see two types of stickies here, the yellow ones and then the orange ones. So to start with, I'll give you guys 2 minutes to, in the yellow ones, for your respective roles, put down anything that would be a challenge to your particular role in relation to any of these categories. So for example, if you are the CEO and you have a dashboard that you use today that is broken every other day because the data feed isn't high quality enough or something, you would put that into a sticky. So you would, I guess I accidentally locked it. One sec. You would, Nico, you might come in here and say, my dashboard sucks. Does that make sense?
It's a very informative requirement. Yeah, the dashboard sucks.
Right. And so the reason why I wrote it that way is that typically when we do these types of sessions, what people write is pain points.
Right.
So
True.
they don't get narrowly specific into like the reason why those things happen. So what we would do obviously is do a deep dive into those items. So if you write my dashboard sucks, what we would do after you write those things, and I give you guys 2 minutes, is spend time talking about why your dashboard sucks, if that makes sense.
Makes sense.
All
Yeah.
right,
And
so
one thing I'll say is, so I won't participate. I'll leave it to the roles I define for everybody else here. And that way, yeah, that's more on them and not on me.
well, and one that's actually an interesting point that I wanted to bring up to you guys as well. Typically, when I do these sessions, whoever the senior most client person in the room is typically gets asked to not participate actively until the end. The point being that typically in these settings, whenever we get a group like this together and the person leading the team is in the room, they tend to have a heavier voice than everybody else. So we want the whole team to be able to give a perspective. So anyways, what I'm going to do to start with, like I said, is I'll set a timer for 3 minutes. You'll see a timer come up on your screen. Yeah, let me lock that one in so you won't be able to do that.
That one too.
Yeah, sorry. I unlocked it so to let you guys have access to the stickies. So you should be able to only click on the stickies. So what I want you working on is, I'll set a timer here. So start writing into any of the stickies your current challenges, the yellow one specifically, your current challenges across the areas that you see there. And if you have any issues, let me know. And so after a couple minutes, what I would start to do is to move the group along. Like if there's any areas, for example, you'll notice that the transformation one and warehousing one are relatively less populated. I would obviously engage the audience to tell them, hey, like, make sure to remember to go to those two. If there's any thoughts that we want to talk about on those, please go ahead. part of my role in the session is to sort of guide everybody to make sure that they're filling out all the sections and that some don't get undue attention over others. You should have heard the timer go off. So finish up your thoughts and then we'll go to the next part of this activity here. Okay, so typically what we would do here next is I would essentially bring you guys to this view that kind of shows you everything we did for this part talking about challenges. And then I would start going one by one through the sections, and then we would talk through the challenges, specifically sticky by sticky that was added onto the board. For the sake of time today, I'm not going to do every single one, but just to demo what that looks like, let's talk about one of them, right? So Anthony, you wrote one that says source files from all over the place. Tell me what that means to you.
Yeah, so in this case, we're getting files from different vendors. So different, in this case, it's like data providers like IQVIA or Viva Compass, and then also from pharmacies getting specific prescription data sets. And they're really coming from all over the place. Like some get emailed to us weekly, some get dropped automatically to an SFTP, some go to an S3 bucket. It's all different data, different formats, and kind of having to deal with, how do we get all of this and get it into the system to support the reporting.
So what I would be doing as you're kind of talking and explaining what you just did would be to type what you said on top of it. So for example, we have too many info sources, right? Like this is sort of like what you said. What I'm doing is essentially capturing your answer on top of what the sticky was. So we meaning you guys and I have reference after the fact for what was said in relation to these. What also happens is that typically when people answer these points, they have somewhat related answers that we can group together. So if we're talking about Kristen, I think you added this one that says files come at different times during the week. And I asked you to explain that one. You likely would have said something very similar to what Anthony said because you're talking about the same topic. So we would group those together so that, after we produce something at the end, we're able to talk about the same things at the same time. Okay, so then what we would do is we would start going through the rest of these as well. So intentionally, one of the things that I would do as we're going along is essentially call out different people so that everybody gets heard across the room. So for example, if I moved on to ingestion, I might say, instead of talking to Anthony again, I might call out Isabel instead. So Isabel, you wrote down incorrect data formats for ingestion. Can you explain what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's kind of getting a file with data and in one column have all sorts of formats when it should be one universal one across the board. So we have to reach back out to whoever that vendor is and get that corrected.
And so one of the dimensions that I would try to extract from Isabel here as well is whether this is a technical problem, a process problem, or something else. Right? Like there are some dimensions of what type of problem are we solving here that we, like you guys and I again, would have some perspective about already. So we know going in that to some degree, some of these problems are technical and some of them are human. So let's go to the next one. So Nate, you wrote slow for warehousing. So I picked that one intentionally. So let's talk about that one.
So yeah, basically the processing just takes too long. We have so much data that the processes are just kind of getting into a point where they're getting in each other's way because it takes 3 hours to run something when we really need it to be closer to an hour.
And the reason why I picked that one intentionally is that is the broadest one. So for example, as I was talking to about my dashboards suck, this is the type of sticky that we might get to say our store or our warehouse is too slow. Okay. So then I would break that down and ask you to tell me what that means, like you just did. A process takes 3 hours when it should take 1 is an insight that we can then take and then build something out of versus it's slow. We can't really do much with. Does that make sense? So what I might ask as a follow-up to that specifically is okay, so walk me through what the 3 hours or what goes into those 3 hours. What does that process look like? Specifically, where are the issues happening? Or I might talk about some of the characteristics of the warehouse in particular, how it was built. If you're a more technical person, I might ask you some of the history behind how the warehouse was built. You may not have had a chance to discuss that. So let's say, okay, Nate, let's say you're the person that built this warehouse. How was it put together? What decisions went into it that caused it to be 3 hours, for example? How downstream do you think that is from the business rule problem that you talked about earlier?
I think it's connected because, in order to create advanced charts and visualizations, you need more advanced business rules that need to be carried out to all the data sources.
So one thing to point out there is that you'll notice that the question was a bit of a leading question in that we would presumably would have already identified that is a particular issue that they're dealing with in our pre-work. to this. And so the point of asking questions like that is that I would have pre-planned certain questions with you guys that you want to hear answers to, that we can essentially surface at particular points of the session where it makes sense. So we would have a set of questions that we need to get answers to that we would surface based on potential connections between points across different parts of the entire conversation.
Typically, I would jump in anytime I wanted to, but I think at this point it was, more or less to kind of keep it moving. But yeah, I agree with that. But if I didn't say anything throughout this whole time frame, I think what you're saying is I'm going to ask you so that it gives you the opportunity to chime in.
And let's actually talk about the flip side of that, because you brought up that you would actually jump in without me having to ask you as well, which happens pretty frequently. Like when we go to a client, there's always a person in the room that's like, jumping in, and you don't have to ask them to voice their opinion for them to voice their opinion, basically. So part of my role is making sure that that person remains constructive and not taking over the conversation. So
Sure.
if we're having a discussion in this, and like, let's say we're talking about ingestion, and this person, hypothetically you, Bruce, was like, I want to talk about sourcing again or something. Like I want to go back to what we were talking about. My role would be to stop you gently and then move on to the next point so that we have enough time to complete the activities. So then what we would do next is I would essentially flip the script to say, okay, well, we talked about challenges quite a bit. So now let's do the opposite and talk about opportunities. Typically, when we service these clients, they typically think of their issues in two formats. One is their problems, like the ones that you guys just did. And the other one would be the things that they want to do, like their wish list. So for example, if we're talking about dashboards, it might be like, I wish my dashboard was real-time data. That's like a common one that we hear all the time, which, we can discuss the merits of as part of the session. But what I would ask you guys to do here is now in the orange stickies, do the same thing that we did with the yellow ones, but I'll give you 2 minutes to input any opportunities that you want to capture as part of like the modernized data world, right? Like if you had everything you could, what would you want your data to do for you across any of these areas?
Wrong color.
You're fine. I can change the color too. So this is something that happens as well that I want to call out as you're going along. In these sessions, whether in person or online, there are like logistical problems, right? Like things happen. So part of the how I handle these is to kind of take it very sort of easygoing. And if things break, then we just kind of move past them. There's no sense in like stopping the session because somebody like messed up the board, or like the sticky went the wrong way, or like it colored the wrong thing. We just move past it and continue focusing the session on the discussion such that we can get something out of it. But keep on writing your stuff.
David, how many people, what's like the max number of people you'd want in one of these at one time?
That's a good question. So I've done these with 2 people. I've done them with up to like probably no more than 15 to 20 people is an ideal setting. But basically, the problem is that you want people that can make decisions for their respective work streams in these conversations, or the people working for them, right? So like you typically don't want more than a dozen or so people, because then it's just like too fragmented to move anything. And so there's like a sweet spot of having enough representation and having too much representation.
Makes sense.
So time is up. So go ahead and finish your answers. So for the sake of today's session, I'm not going to ask you to redo the same process of explaining these, but let's pretend that, we had reviewed every single session again, or every section again. That is a super broad statement, but you get the idea. So the point of doing an activity like this, the one we're about to do, is to come up with tactical wish list items that say, this is what I want to achieve. This is who I want to serve through achieving that. And this is the outcome that we're going to achieve by creating that into reality. So we call this how might we, because it's in the statement in the form of a how might we statement, which is how might we do X for such and such person so that we can achieve something, right? The point of forcing that structure is to think, or to force people to not only think about what you're doing, but also who it's for, like who it's serving and what outcome it's achieving for those people as well. Does that make sense? So what I would like you guys to do for this is for each of you to come up with one idea, one audience, one outcome based. So time is up. Go ahead and finish your answers, please. So one mechanism that I would point out here that typically happens in this particular type of activity is that you guys came up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ideas. As we are discussing them, you have the ability to continue putting in ideas based on what everybody else said. Like if one of you starts talking about templatizing files, and then somebody's like, oh, that's a great idea. You know what? Like, I think I have something semi-related. I would encourage you all to go back and like, as we are talking through these, to fill out the blank idea stickies with whatever comes out of the discussion for this. So for this one, the objective would be slightly different than before. So now where before we were talking about things at a very broad level, what I would want to start doing here is talking about some of your concrete ideas in very narrow terms. So Nate, let's say you wrote fully automate the end-to-end process. Walk me through what you meant by that. And so explain the whole structure, please.
Yeah, basically, so that let's just say this is a process that runs on a weekly basis, that there's no manual input required. So basically, anything that needs to happen is all done on a an automated process. There's going to be all of the files get dropped into wherever they need to. But nobody needs to go in and move the file or touch the file or anything like that. And everything is just happening on an automated basis. Literally, no intervention needed at all. Process just runs and we monitor to make sure it works properly.
Fair. So now you'll notice that everything that you talked about is still the what. So now what I would ask you is like, okay, who is that for and why do they need it?
So, I mean, ultimately it impacts everybody, but the main people would be the data team if they're the ones that are going to be involved in it. Might be the IT team, depending on who it is. In this case, it's me in our scenario here. And basically just making it so that they don't need to worry about going in and touching anything. They don't have to worry about getting up early to make sure that something gets loaded. They don't have to touch anything where they're changing file names, file types, anything like that.
So traditionally, this is also where we would get other parts of the room chiming in with their perspective on this item. So like if other people, like if we were in a real setting, typically this is where like, let's say Bruce might say like, oh yeah, this process sucks. Like today, like we should really do this. This is where we start hearing opinions and priority. So we start getting a perception of what actually matters to them via these. So I might obviously bring you to like, okay, why is this important to you? Like, what do you want to achieve through this? And then you would tell me this so that
Nobody has to touch it. And so that, like I said, nobody needs to get involved. We've had issues where somebody needed to manually do something. And because of that, there was a mistake and it caused the process to fail. That somebody was me. And basically just making sure that there's as few places that can go wrong as possible because everything is happening automatically.
Yeah. And again, when I was talking about the things that the conversation topics that come up where you realize that something's an idea as in another part of the team, this is where that happens. Like when you hear this, a lot of these details, people start connecting the dots between, say, like the lack of automation in the process and something else that is a problem for them. And then they would bring it up as part of this typically. What we're trying to get to here is not just the what specifically Nate is trying to achieve, but also the details around why that is not achievable today. So I might ask you, okay, Nate, let's talk about why that's not possible today. Like, why haven't you guys already tried doing this? And then you might say,
data sources don't come in a process that allows us to do that. For example, we get one of the files comes in via an email that I need to pick up and drop somewhere else.
And so then obviously the ideal scenario would be that you say something that is tied to the challenges that we talked about in section 1. So I can say, well, like related to what we talked about before, like we already talked about this because X, Y, and Z reason. Are those two things related? You would say yes. And so now we have a cohesive theme across those things. Again, when I was talking about the things that the conversation topics that come up where you realize that something's an idea as in another part of the team, this is where that happens. Like when you hear this, a lot of these details, people start connecting the dots between, say, like the lack of automation in the process and something else that is a problem for them. And then they would bring it up as part of this typically. What we're trying to get to here is not just the what specifically Nate is trying to achieve, but also the details around why that is not achievable today. So I might ask you, okay, Nate, let's talk about why that's not possible today. Like, why haven't you guys already tried doing this? And then you might say,
data sources don't come in a process that allows us to do that. For example, we get one of the files comes in via an email that I need to pick up and drop somewhere else.
And so then obviously the ideal scenario would be that you say something that is tied to the challenges that we talked about in section 1. So I can say, well, like related to what we talked about before, like we already talked about this because X, Y, and Z reason. Are those two things related? You would say yes. And so now we have a cohesive theme across those things. One of the biggest pieces or biggest advantages of a setting like this is talking about priority. So typically the sessions that we do would essentially have two functions. The open-ended discussion that we did at the beginning, and then forcing people to make a decision about the relative priority of things to each other. All the challenges that we are talking about can't be solved at the same time. It's just a matter of time, right? Or a function of time rather. you'll notice that I'm putting the yellow stickies that you guys came up with, the ideas you came up with, into the top of the board here in the middle. Can you see that? So in the setting that we're setting up here, what I might want you guys to do is to collectively prioritize this together. So like out of the 5 that we have here, typically we would have many more than 5. I would ask you all to place each of the stickies into this grid that you see in the bottom. The way that I typically build this grid is by talking about the impact of solving for the idea or that problem, and the complexity of solving that problem in the first place. So when I say complexity, I don't mean just like the technical difficulty of solving for that. It's also how much time is it going to take? How costly is it? How many people is it going to take to solve this problem? And do we even have them? So it's essentially thinking about the entire like cost, so to speak, of solving that in relation to how impactful that is. Putting those each of these into buckets where like you have things that are going to be deprioritized, things that won't move the needle organizationally, things that are big ideas, so meaning projects that are impactful but really hard, and the simple, very easy, impactful problems that need to be solved. Those are your easy wins that then enable us to understand, like we here, to understand what we need to go tackle first. That's how we define the biggest problems that they have, is by forcing them. So if I gave you guys, say, 2 minutes to together define where in this grid each of the 5 stickies go, I might designate somebody in the room to say, Nate, take a first stab at thinking where each of these go in the grid. So like place them wherever you think they go. And so you might go and do that.
I would literally go through and do all 5 of them.
I would ask you to be the guinea pig, right? And like place them wherever you think they are. For the sake of time, we're doing it this way. If there's many of them, I might individually ask you guys to put them where you think they go for the ones that you came up with. For the sake of this one, because it's just 5, I'm going to ask only one of you to do it. If we were in a physical room, it would work this way as well. Like I would ask one of you to take a physical sticky we have written down and put it on the wall and place it where you think it goes. So for the sake of this, Nate, I'll set a timer for 2 minutes. Take each sticky and put it where you think it goes in terms of the whole organization. So read it out and then place it in whatever quadrant you think it goes.
Pressure's on. Oh, that's not what I needed. I need it.
David, while he's doing that, do you ever find that people who are put on the spot like that are hesitant to put what they really think because they don't want to be like, oh, prioritizing my thing over somebody else?
Right. So one of the things that we would do at the beginning when we're introducing this effort is to explain that you're supposed to look at everything that you're doing today from the perspective of the organization as a whole and not your own. So yes, the answer is absolutely. One other thing that I'll explain in a second is that everything that you're talking about here is relative to each other. So it's not that any of these are any less important than the others, is that some are more important than others, some of the ideas. And so when I ask you to prioritize and give them importance, it's more like which ones do you think are more relatively important, and let everybody else complain that they are more important than you think, essentially. All right. So Nate, you're done, right?
Yep.
Okay. So let's say, we had finished this part. Nate had placed all of these. I would now open it up to the room, get impressions from everybody else. So like, let's say, I don't know, Isabel, do you disagree with the placement on any of these at a high level?
I do not. No.
Perfect. So great. We have agreement. Anybody in the room disagree with the placement of these?
Fully automated, I think, could go up. I think the impact would be greater.
Okay. So to stop you guys right there for a second, what we would do is start to break down why that is. So Bruce, you would get the floor for like 30 seconds to explain why that is. You might say, well, I think it's bigger impact than validating all of the data in the warehouse every time it's updated. So we might move that down and move this up. Does that make sense? What you'll notice, though, if I went back to where it was before, is that when I asked Nate to put in the like relative priority of these things, he placed 4 of the 5 above the line. That means that he's prioritizing all of those 4 things, and that's too many. So if I said we only want to pick 2 priorities, part of this exercise would be to force you guys to move things below the line as well. So if let's say we had this discussion, we had reorganized, you guys decided that, these 2 are going to be flipped now. And then I went and said, okay, Nate, let's go back to you. The one thing I didn't tell you to do here was that you only get to pick 2 priorities. You get to pick 1 big idea to focus on and 1 easy win. So if I force you to do that, which would you downgrade and why? In this case, it's pretty easy because there's only 5 of them, but normally there's 30 or 40 of these. And so the decision is much harder, right? So you probably would pick the top 2 here. Normally there's like a bunch, like a dozen of each. So we actually have to start prioritizing down and moving down things to make sure that we pick the ones that the group cares about. And it's to essentially force you to select these three and move them down. So when we say deprioritize, it's not that like fully automating the end-to-end process isn't important. It's that it's less important relative to building the set of dashboards that Kristen was coming up with.
When you're doing this, would you generally do what you did where you don't give any kind of numbers, like put them where you want first and then do it again after and be like, okay, now limit it down?
Correct. So that's why the grid is sort of existing in relativity and not defined by like a number scale, is because getting into the numbers, in my experience, gets into like discussions of like what's a 6 versus what's an 8 versus what's a 4, which is not productive. This forces you to think kind of abstractly about impact and simplicity, and sort of more of the relativity of them rather than the like, oh, well, like, automating the process is like a 6 on the complexity scale, but like a 10 on the impact scale or something. That's not, it doesn't really matter, because the purpose of this activity in the first place is for us the consultants to understand where they see the most value out of the activities that we're doing, rather than like the understanding the actual complexities in detail, because that's for follow-up conversation. We don't need to do that here.
Again, I wasn't sure. Are we doing this after the meetings without the client?
No, this is something that they're doing in the session with us. So like this is part of the workshop.
Yeah.
The flip side of that is that we need to understand sort of the cultural landscape of the client and the things that we are not privy to because we don't work with them. So that would be, what are the things that we need to take advantage of? Like who are the people, teams, and resources that we can use to make this go happen faster? What are the anchors? Like, what are the challenges that we're going to run into that we haven't been told? So from a technical perspective, logistical perspective, or human. And then most importantly, how do we get around both the drivers and the anchors to achieve our goals? So the point of this exercise, this is called a sailboat exercise, because as you can tell, like there's stickies for each of the things that we just talked about. So we won't do it because I want to skip to the next part to just like talk about the logistics. But I'll just point out that the last activity or types of activity we would always do is to talk about the human factors that come up in all of these things and get people's perspectives on what's going to be difficult for us as we implement the things that we came up with and what we can take advantage of.
How often do you find that people are not helping? Like they're not being super useful. They're kind of just in the meeting, but not really providing much value.
It happens. Part of the pre-work with, especially with our clients, like our joint clients, is to ensure that a lot of that doesn't happen by socializing a lot of these workshops such that everybody participates where possible. But it's unavoidable. I mean, some people are just not in the right headspace sometimes. Some people are just difficult. And a lot of the work that we will do together is to minimize some of that. If somebody is being belligerent or argumentative for no good reason, it's to like minimize them. So I won't say that it doesn't happen, but I will say that a significant chunk of the pre-work is understanding how we can get around that, similar to the question that Kristen asked earlier.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think one of the main things that I could think of being potentially problematic is finding that balance of getting the collaboration across teams, but also having topics that the teams actually care about, because I can definitely see situations where we're going to have somebody from an IT side and somebody more from the commercial side. And I think it's good to have them in the conversation together to get those pieces. But at the same point, they're going to stop paying attention on the parts they don't care about when we ideally like that not to happen.
When you do this, you could be talking a huge project. It could be a year-long project or whatever. So you would come in and you would do a session like this, but now you're going to break this. You're going to take some of these things and you're going to have maybe 5 sessions similar to this to get deeper and more specific, right?
Yeah, that is one format, is that we would do like one broad session to start with and then deeper sessions to begin with or to follow. What we may also do instead is, instead of doing one broad one and then specific ones, we may do 5 broad sessions back to back to back to back, right? Like we might break it down into pieces so that instead of having like one very dense day-long session, we might do 4 2-hour sessions instead. That happens sometimes for like logistical reasons, for, we don't want to sit in a room a whole day reasons, and anything in between. Is that the exact format that we would define and how that contributes to whatever we're trying to generate at the end is something that me and you guys would discuss as part of the prep.